What happens when a stranger leaves a blue box on your table and tells you you'll need it tonight? Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe, hit the hype button, and like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And tell us in the comments, what would you do in this situation? I didn't open it at the restaurant. I went home, locked the door, and realized my son and his wife had already decided I no longer mattered. My name is Cole Merrick. I'm 58 years old, and I own a restaurant group that most people don't know exists. That's by design. I've spent 30 years building something quiet. 4 locations across the city, each profitable, each run by people who understand that good food doesn't need to scream. The buildings are in trusts. The partnerships are layered. The intellectual property, recipes, branding, operational systems sits in a holding company that traces back to me through paths that would take a forensic accountant weeks to untangle. But to my son, Evan, and his wife, Marissa, I'm just the old man who got lucky once. The restaurant that night was called Terrace. Nice enough, but not loud. White tablecloths, soft lighting, the kind of place where people speak in measured tones and the waiters know when to disappear. I'd suggested it because Evan had mentioned wanting to discuss family matters, and I thought neutral ground might help. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. They arrived 20 minutes late. Evan walked in first, his phone pressed to his ear, nodding at something the person on the other end was saying. He was wearing a sport coat that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was styled in that careful way young men do now, messy on purpose, with product that probably came in a jar smaller than my thumb. Marissa followed 3 feet behind him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down to something I didn't yet understand. She was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful. Deliberately, strategically, with every element calculated for maximum effect. Her dress was simple but expensive. Her jewelry was understated but present. Her smile, when she finally offered it, didn't reach her eyes. "Dad," Evan said, sliding into the booth across from me. He didn't apologize for being late. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just sat down and immediately began scanning the menu like he'd been waiting for this moment all day. "The sea base here is supposed to be good?" "Hello to you too," I said. Marissa took her seat beside him, arranging herself with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago how to occupy space without appearing to need it. "Cole," she said. "Not Dad. Never Dad. In 3 years of marriage to my son, she'd never once called me anything but my first name." "Thank you for meeting us." I nodded. What else was there to do? The waiter came. Evan ordered a bottle of wine without asking what I wanted. Marissa requested sparkling water with a slice of cucumber, not lemon, cucumber specifically, and made a small production of studying the appetizer list before deciding she wasn't hungry after all. "So," I said, once the waiter had retreated, "what did you want to discuss?" Evan glanced at Marissa. She gave him a tiny nod, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. I was watching closely. "We've been thinking," Evan began, and something in his tone made my stomach tighten. It was the voice he used when he wanted something. I'd heard it 1,000 times over the years, when he needed money for college, for his first apartment, for the wedding that had cost more than most people's houses. Each time I'd given him what he asked for. Each time the gratitude had lasted shorter than the time before. "Thinking about what?" "The future," Marissa said smoothly, taking over. This was how they operated, I realized. Evan opened the door, and Marissa walked through it. "Your future, specifically. We've been worried about you, Cole. Living alone in that big house, running those restaurants by yourself. It's a lot for someone your age." "My age?" I repeated. "You're not getting any younger," Evan added, and I wanted to tell him that no one was getting any younger, that time moved in only one direction, that this particular observation was so obvious it bordered on insulting. But I didn't say anything. I just sat there, my hands folded on the table, and let them talk. They talked for 45 minutes, about succession planning, about streamlining operations, about bringing in fresh perspectives, and modern management techniques. Evan used phrases he'd clearly rehearsed: synergy, optimization, stakeholder value. Marissa nodded along, occasionally interjecting with supportive comments that somehow always steered the conversation back to the same conclusion. It was time for me to step aside. Not retire, exactly. They were careful never to use that word. But step aside. Take a back seat. Let the next generation handle things. The next generation being Evan, whose primary business experience consisted of a marketing job he'd held for 3 years before quitting to pursue opportunities. The opportunities, as far as I could tell, consisted mainly of spending money I'd given him and attending social events with Marissa's friends. "We've actually put together a proposal," Marissa said, and I watched her pull a folder from her purse. It was thin, maybe 10 pages, bound with a clip that looked like it came from a nice office supply store. "Nothing formal yet, just some preliminary thoughts. We thought you might want to take a look, see if anything resonates." She slid it across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. "What kind of proposal?" I asked. "Just ideas," Evan said quickly. "About restructuring, making things more efficient. You'd still be involved, obviously, in an advisory capacity." Advisory capacity. The phrase hung in the air between us like smoke. I looked at my son, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. The expensive coat, the careful hair, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. When had this happened? When had the boy I'd raised become this person sitting across from me, treating me like an obstacle to be managed rather than a father to be respected? I thought about all the years I'd spent building the restaurants, the early mornings and late nights, the loans I'd taken out, the risks I'd absorbed, the relationships I'd cultivated one handshake at a time. I thought about the trust structures I'd created to protect everything, protect it from lawsuits, from tax exposure, from exactly this kind of conversation. They didn't know about any of that. They thought I was simple, old school, not ambitious. They were wrong. The waiter came back with the wine. Evan tasted it and nodded approvingly, though I suspected he couldn't have distinguished a premium vintage from grocery store plonk. Glasses were filled, small talk was attempted. I participated just enough to avoid obvious conflict, answering questions about the restaurants in vague terms, deflecting inquiries about my health and living situation with practiced ease. Somewhere around dessert, which only Evan ordered, a chocolate something or other that he ate with the enthusiasm of a child, I noticed the woman. She was sitting alone at a table near the window, nursing a glass of red wine and reading something on her phone. Unremarkable in every way. Middle age, dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that suggested competence rather than beauty. She wore a simple blazer over a simple blouse, the kind of professional attire that could have belonged to a lawyer or an accountant or 1,000 other occupations that required looking serious without looking flashy. I wouldn't have noticed her at all, except for one thing. She was watching me. Not obviously, not in a way that would have attracted attention, but every few minutes her eyes would drift from her phone to our table, lingering just long enough to suggest purpose before returning to whatever she was reading. It was the kind of surveillance that most people would never detect. Subtle, patient, professional. I detected it because I'd spent 30 years in an industry where reading people was essential to survival. The meal ended. Evan made a show of reaching for the check, but I'd already arranged to have it charged to my account. A small thing, but I wanted them to remember who was still paying, who had always been paying. "Think about the proposal," Marissa said as we stood to leave. She touched my arm with her fingertips. Brief, clinical, the way you might touch a piece of furniture you were considering purchasing. "There's no rush, obviously, but the sooner we can get things moving, the better for everyone." "I'll think about it," I said. Evan hugged me. It was brief and awkward, the kind of embrace that satisfies social obligation without requiring actual affection. "Good to see you, Dad. We should do this more often." "We should," I agreed, knowing we wouldn't. They left first, walking toward the front of the restaurant with their heads already bent toward each other, already beginning whatever conversation they'd been waiting to have once I was out of earshot. I watched them go, feeling something heavy settle in my chest, not quite anger, not quite sadness, something in between that didn't have a name. I was gathering my coat when the woman appeared. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to making entrances without attracting attention. One moment she wasn't there, the next she was standing beside my table, a small blue box in her hands. "Mr. Merrick," she said. Her voice was calm, professional, controlled. "My name is Ruth Calder. I apologize for the intrusion." I should have been alarmed. A stranger approaching me, knowing my name, holding a mysterious object. These were not normal circumstances. But something about her manner suggested this wasn't a threat. It was something else, something I couldn't yet identify. "Do I know you?" I asked. "No," she said. "But I know you. I know your situation, and I know what your son and his wife are planning." She placed the blue box on the table. It was smaller than a shoebox, made of some material that looked like cardboard but felt heavier, more substantial. The color was unusual, not sky blue or navy, but something in between, almost electric. "You'll need this tonight," she said. "What is it?" "Everything you need to understand what's really happening." She met my eyes directly, without flinching, without apparent emotion. "I'm not asking you to trust me, Mr. Merrick. I'm asking you to look. That's all. Just look." She turned and walked away before I could respond. By the time I thought to follow her, she was gone, disappeared into the crowd near the hostess stand, vanished like she'd never existed at all. I stood there for a long moment, looking down at the blue box. It sat on the white tablecloth like a question waiting to be answered. The restaurant continued around me. Conversations, laughter, the clink of glasses, but I heard none of it. All my attention was focused on that box and what it might contain. I picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been, heavier than its size suggested. There was a faint seal around the edges, not decorative, but functional, the kind designed to show if it had been opened before. The seal was intact. I didn't open it at the restaurant. I tucked it under my arm, walked to my car in the parking lot, and sat behind the wheel for 10 minutes before starting the engine. The lot was empty except for a few scattered vehicles, their windows dark, their occupants long departed. The restaurant's sign glowed softly in my rearview mirror. Somewhere inside, staff were cleaning tables and counting tips and doing all the small tasks that ended a shift. They didn't know about the box. They didn't know about my son and his wife and their carefully rehearsed proposal. They didn't know about any of it. I was alone, and somehow the woman had known I would be. I drove home slowly, taking the long route through neighborhoods I'd known for decades. Past the first restaurant I'd ever owned, now a coffee shop with a different name. Past the house where Evan had grown up, now belonging to strangers who'd repainted the shutters. Past all the landmarks of a life I'd built piece by piece, year by year, until it had become something substantial enough that other people wanted to take it from me. The blue box sat on the passenger seat, catching light from street lamps, glowing faintly in the darkness. I didn't open it, not yet, but I knew I would. My house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. It's a large house, too large for one person, really, but I'd bought it when Evan's mother was still alive, when we'd planned to fill it with children and grandchildren and all the noise that comes with a growing family. Those plans had changed. She'd passed 12 years ago, quietly, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and regret. The children had never materialized beyond Evan. The grandchildren, if they ever came, hadn't arrived yet. Now it was just me and too many rooms and a silence that sometimes felt like a physical presence. I parked in the garage and sat for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The blue box was still on the passenger seat. I could see it in my peripheral vision, a small rectangle of color that seemed to pulse with significance. I should have been tired. The dinner had been exhausting in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, but I felt alert, almost hyper-aware, as though my body understood something my mind hadn't yet processed. I took the box inside. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it. Clean counters, empty sink, a single light burning over the stove that I'd forgotten to turn off. I placed the box on the table and stood looking at it. "Just look," the woman had said. "That's all. Just look." But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I opened the refrigerator and pulled out leftovers from yesterday. Cold chicken, some vegetables, the remains of a salad that was starting to wilt. I ate standing at the counter, methodically working through food I didn't taste, for reasons I couldn't explain. The clock on the microwave read 9:47 p.m. I washed my dishes, wiped down the counter, folded the kitchen towel and hung it precisely on its hook. All the small rituals of routine, performed not because they were necessary, but because they were familiar, because they bought time. The blue box waited. I went upstairs, changed out of my dinner clothes into the loose pants and old sweater I wore around the house, brushed my teeth, checked my phone for messages I knew wouldn't be there. There was one text from Evan, sent 40 minutes ago. "Great seeing you tonight, Dad. Think about what we discussed. The future is now. The future is now." What did that even mean? The future was always now, perpetually arriving and perpetually receding, an endless present tense that made planning impossible and regret inevitable. It was something people said when they wanted to sound profound without actually saying anything. I deleted the message without responding. The house felt different somehow. Not quiet. It was always quiet, but charged, expectant, like the air before a storm, when you can feel the pressure changing even though the sky is still clear. I went back downstairs. The blue box hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. Boxes don't move by themselves. But it seemed different now, more substantial, as though it had been waiting for me to be ready. I sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I was in control. I didn't open it. Instead, I sat there and thought about all the moments I'd missed. The small humiliations I'd absorbed without comment. The times Evan had canceled dinners at the last minute. The times Marissa had spoken to me in that carefully modulated voice, the one that suggested she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence. The times I'd written checks and received nothing in return but brief acknowledgments and requests for more. Were they small, those moments? I'd told myself they were. I'd cataloged them under family dynamics and generational differences, and all the other euphemisms we use to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. But sitting there, in my kitchen, with that blue box on the table, I understood something I'd been refusing to understand for years. They weren't small, they added up, and the sum they'd created was larger than any of its individual parts. The proposal Marissa had given me was still in my coat pocket. I'd forgotten about it until now, or maybe refused to remember. I retrieved it and spread the pages on the table. 10 pages, neatly formatted, professional-looking, which meant Marissa had probably hired someone to create it, probably with money that had originally been mine. The first page was an executive summary. The following pages contained charts and projections and organizational diagrams that reduced my life's work to boxes and arrows. The Merrick Restaurant Group, A Path Forward. That was the title. They'd named it like it was their company, not mine. Like I'd already handed over the keys, and this document was just formalizing what had already been decided. I read through it carefully, the way I read contracts before signing them. Most of it was vague. Transition periods, and leadership restructuring, and equity reallocation frameworks. But buried in the details, hidden among the buzzwords and charts, I found what I was looking for. They wanted everything. Not just management, not just operational control. They wanted the trust structures dissolved. They wanted the holding companies merged into a single entity, one that Evan would control. They wanted my signature on documents that would transfer legal authority across a series of steps carefully designed to look gradual but were actually comprehensive. And once those signatures were acquired, once the legal framework was in place, I would have nothing. Advisory capacity. That's what they'd called it. But looking at the structure they'd outlined, I understood the truth. Advisory capacity meant a chair in a room where decisions had already been made. It meant a title without power. It meant exactly the kind of irrelevance they'd been rehearsing for during 3 years of canceled dinners and patronizing conversations and proposal folders slid across restaurant tables. I put the proposal aside. The blue box waited. I went to bed without opening it. I don't know why. Fear, maybe. Or the sense that once I opened it, things would change in ways I couldn't predict. The unknown is terrifying, not because it's dangerous, but because it eliminates the comfort of pretending everything is fine. My bedroom was cold. December in the city, and the heating system was old, struggling to keep up with a house built for aesthetics rather than efficiency. I crawled under the covers and stared at the ceiling, running through scenarios in my mind. What if the woman was lying? What if the box contained nothing? Or worse, something irrelevant. A mistake, a case of mistaken identity that would make me feel foolish for taking it seriously. But she'd known my name. She'd known about Evan and Marissa. She'd known I would be at that restaurant, at that table, at that exact moment. That wasn't a mistake. That was intention. I thought about the proposal again, about the trust structures I'd built, the legal protections I'd layered into place over decades. They didn't know about those. They thought I was simple. A restaurant owner with some locations and a nice house. Nothing more complicated than that. They were wrong, and part of me, the part that had built those protections in the first place, had always known this moment was coming. Sleep came eventually, but it wasn't restful. I dreamed about boxes, about documents signed and unsigned, about Evan as a child, running through a park I didn't recognize, calling for me in a voice I could barely hear, about Marissa standing behind him, watching, her expression unreadable. I woke at 2:14 a.m. The house was silent. Outside, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. 3 sharp sounds, then nothing. The numbers on my bedside clock glowed faintly in the darkness. I lay there for a long moment, listening to my own breathing, and then I got up. The stairs creaked under my feet. The kitchen light was still on, casting its familiar glow over the table, the counter, the box that had been waiting for hours. I sat down, picked up the box, turned it over in my hands, examining it from every angle. The seal was still intact. A thin strip of something that looked like ribbon but felt like paper, wrapped around the seam where lid met base. I found the loose end, pulled gently, and felt the seal separate with a faint whisper. I lifted the lid. Inside, arranged with careful precision, was a stack of documents. Not originals, copies, from the look of them, but high-quality copies, the kind made on equipment designed for legal or financial purposes. Beneath the documents was a small envelope. Beneath that, a USB drive in a plastic case. I removed the documents first, read the first page, then the second, then flipped quickly through the rest without stopping. They confirmed everything. The proposal Evan and Marissa had given me, that had been the polite version, the one designed for consumption. These documents showed what was really happening. meetings held without my knowledge, communications with my business partners that referenced succession planning and ownership transfer without ever mentioning my name, legal opinions about the enforceability of trust clauses, financial projections that assumed my absence. My son and his wife hadn't been planning a transition, they'd been planning a takeover, and they'd been doing it for months, maybe longer. The timestamps on these documents went back almost a year of smiling faces and family dinners and proposals presented like suggestions while the machinery of betrayal turned quietly in the background. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded note, handwritten in a script I didn't recognize. These copies are yours to keep. The originals are safe. Nothing has been filed yet. Nothing is final. You still have time. R.C. R.C. Ruth Calder. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn began to gray the windows, reading through every document, every communication, every piece of evidence that showed exactly what my son had become. It was cold in the kitchen. I hadn't turned on the heat, but I barely felt it. What I felt instead was clarity, the fog of denial lifting, the excuses I'd made for years dissolving like morning mist, and beneath the clarity, something else, something that might have been anger. But it was too calm for anger, too patient. It was something older, something that had been waiting a long time for a reason to wake up. I made coffee, sat with it until it went cold, read the documents again, and then I started a folder on my computer, a new folder labeled with today's date. I opened my phone, found the contact I was looking for, and made a call. The voice that answered was groggy with sleep. "Cole, do you know what time it is?" "I know," I said. "Nolan, I need to meet with you. Today. It's important." A long pause. Then, "That kind of important." "That kind of important." "I'll clear my schedule," he said. "Come to the office at 9. I hung up and looked at the calendar app on my phone. Between today's appointments and reminders, I noticed something that made me pause. A reminder I hadn't created, or maybe I had, long ago, and forgotten about it. It was scheduled for tonight. Just 3 words. Investor tasting event. The invitation had arrived weeks ago. One of those community business gatherings where restaurants showcased new menus and investors mingled and people like Evan pretended to be more important than they were. I'd planned to skip it. Now I understood that I couldn't. Nolan Pierce had been my attorney for 23 years. He was the one who'd helped me structure the trusts when my wife got sick, back before anyone knew how bad it would get. He was the one who'd reviewed every partnership agreement, every lease extension, every licensing deal that had built the restaurant group into what it was today. And he was the one who'd warned me, years ago, that Evan's spending habits and poor career choices might someday become a legal problem as well as a personal one. I hadn't listened then. I was listening now. His office was on the 14th floor of a building that had once been the tallest in this part of the city. The view from his window showed a skyline that had grown up around it. Newer towers, shinier facades, the architectural ego of developers competing to leave their mark. Nolan had never moved to one of those newer buildings. He preferred the weight of history, the solidity of brick and steel that had weathered decades of storms. "Show me what you've got," he said, once I was seated. I gave him the documents from the blue box. All of them, the communications, the legal opinions, the financial projections, everything except the USB drive, which I'd left at home in a drawer that locked. He read in silence, turning pages slowly, occasionally making small sounds that might have been a surprise or might have been confirmation of things he'd already suspected. His face gave nothing away. That was part of what made him good at his job. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at me. "Where did you get these?" "A woman named Ruth Calder gave them to me." "And who is Ruth Calder?" "I don't know," I admitted. "She approached me at dinner last night, gave me a box, told me I'd need it tonight." "Tonight," Nolan repeated. "The investor event?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, "These documents are damaging, Cole. Some of them appear to be internal communications from your partners. Others look like legal memoranda from attorneys. Not me, obviously, but someone representing interests that aren't yours. I understand. Do you?" He leaned forward, his expression serious. "If these are authentic, and I'll need to verify that, then what your son and daughter-in-law have been planning goes well beyond a simple power grab. They've been cultivating relationships with your investment partners. They've been getting legal advice on how to challenge the trust structures, and they've been doing it for almost a year without telling you." "I know. The trust structures are solid, Cole. I designed them to be. But no structure is impervious to attack, especially if the people attacking it have inside information and enough money to hire good lawyers. He paused. They've been hiring good lawyers. So I noticed. Which brings us to the question of what you want to do about it. I'd spent the drive over thinking about exactly that. What did I want? Confrontation? Revenge? Some form of justice that would make right what had been done wrong? The answer, when it came, was simpler than I expected. I want them to know, I said. Tonight, at the event. I want them to know that I know, and I want everyone else to know too. Nolan studied me for a long moment. Public exposure carries risks. Your son's reputation, yes, but also yours. People will ask questions. Investors might get nervous. There could be business implications. I understand the risks. Do you understand the alternatives? We could handle this privately. Legal proceedings, trust enforcement, quiet restructuring that removes their access without creating a public spectacle. And if I do that, I said, what stops them from trying again? What stops them from going to the partners I haven't spoken to yet? The investors who don't know the full picture and telling whatever story serves their purposes? Nothing, he admitted. Exactly. They need to be exposed. Not punished. I'm not interested in punishment. But exposed. They've been operating in shadows for a year. It's time to turn on the lights. Nolan nodded slowly. Then we need to move quickly. I'll pull the trust documentation and prepare amendments that reinforce your control. I'll also prepare statements regarding ownership structures and decision-making authority. Things you can reference tonight if needed. And the documents from the box? Copies only for now. Don't show anyone the originals. And Cole? He hesitated. Be careful. I don't know who this Ruth Calder is or why she's helping you, but people don't provide this kind of information for free. There's always a cost. I know, I said. I'll be careful. I left his office with a folder of legal documents, authorizations, ownership confirmations, trust provisions that spelled out in precise language exactly who controlled what. The language was dense, almost impenetrable to anyone without legal training. But the meaning was clear. The restaurants were mine. The trusts were mine. The partnerships, the IP rights, the revenue streams that flowed from 30 years of work, all mine. Evan and Marissa had been building their castle on sand. I drove home slowly, taking back streets I'd known for years. The city looked different somehow. Sharper edged, more detailed, as though someone had adjusted the focus on a camera that had been slightly blurred. I noticed things I'd stopped noticing, the way light fell on brick walls, the rhythm of traffic signals, the faces of strangers walking past with their own concerns, their own dramas, their own blue boxes waiting to be opened. At home, I went to my office, the small room at the back of the house where I kept files and records and the computer I use for business matters. I opened the folder I'd created that morning, the one labeled with today's date, and began organizing. The documents from Nolan went into one section. The copies from the blue box went into another. I created a timeline, working backward from the present to piece together the sequence of events that had led to this moment. It was meticulous work, the kind I'd done many times before when evaluating business decisions or assessing potential partnerships. But this time, the subject was different. This time, I was mapping the architecture of my own son's betrayal. By early afternoon, I had a clear picture. 9 months ago, first contact between Evan and one of my investment partners. Casual outreach presented as getting to know the family business. 7 months ago, follow-up meetings. Discussions about succession planning that never mentioned my name. 5 months ago. Legal consultations. Questions about trust provisions, ownership structures, potential challenges. 3 months ago. Formal proposals. Draft documents that bore no resemblance to the mild suggestions Marissa had presented last night. And throughout, a campaign of positioning. Evan presenting himself as the natural heir. Marissa cultivating relationships with spouses and social contacts. Both of them building a narrative in which I was the obstacle. Old, outdated, resistant to change. And they were the solution. It was methodical, professional even. The kind of operation that required time, money, and commitment. They'd been very committed. I looked at the clock. 3 p.m. The investor event started at 7. I had 4 hours to prepare. I started with the USB drive from the blue box, plugged it into my computer, and watched as files populated the screen. Audio files mostly, with dates that corresponded to entries on my timeline. I clicked on the first one. Evan's voice, clear and distinct. The trust situation is more complicated than I expected. There are layers, but my contact thinks we can challenge them if we approach it the right way. I clicked on another. Marissa, her professional tones unmistakable. Atao, Cole doesn't understand modern business. He's stuck in the past. The partners we've spoken to agree that fresh leadership would be beneficial. I listened to all of them. 14 recordings, conversations that spanned months. My son had never been a particularly good liar. Hearing him now, rehearsing talking points with his wife, discussing strategies for minimizing my influence, planning celebrations for victories not yet won, it was like watching a performance I'd somehow missed from the front row. But I wasn't angry. That surprised me. Anger would have been easier, more immediate. What I felt instead was something colder. Clarity. Resolution. The quiet certainty of a decision made. I called Nolan back. I need one more thing, I said. For tonight. I told him what I wanted. He was quiet for a moment, then said, That can be arranged. How quickly? Give me 2 hours. I hung up and began getting dressed. The afternoon passed in measured increments. I chose my clothes carefully, not for impression, but for purpose. A simple dark suit I'd owned for years, a white shirt, no tie, comfortable shoes, the kind designed for standing long periods. I wasn't dressing for a performance, I was dressing for work. While I prepared, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't answer. Evan, twice. Looking forward to seeing you tonight, Dad. And Marissa says hi. We saved you a spot at our table. The exclamation points felt aggressive, weaponized enthusiasm that expected nothing in return but compliance. I turned my phone to silent and finished adjusting my cuffs. The event was held at a converted warehouse in the Arts District, one of those industrial spaces that developers had transformed into a venue for exactly these kinds of gatherings. High ceilings, exposed brick, lighting designed to make everyone look both interesting and wealthy. The city's business community loved these places. They provided the perfect backdrop for conversations about growth, opportunity, and the inevitable future of commerce. I arrived at 7:15, deliberately late enough to ensure that most attendees had already gathered, but early enough to observe the dynamics before making my presence known. The main floor was arranged in tasting stations. Each restaurant, including 2 of mine, showcased sample dishes, while investors and partners circulated with drinks and business cards. Jazz played from hidden speakers, soft enough to allow conversation, loud enough to provide cover for the kind of side discussions that actually mattered. I saw Evan almost immediately. He was holding court near the far wall, surrounded by a small group of men I recognized. Partners, investors, people with enough capital to make things happen. His movements were animated, expressive, the gestures of someone convinced of his own importance. Beside him, Marissa stood with a wine glass, contributing periodic comments that drew appreciative laughter. They hadn't seen me yet. Good. I moved through the crowd slowly, making eye contact with people I knew, shaking hands without committing to extended conversations. A few asked about the restaurants. I answered in general terms. Good year, strong performance, looking at expansion opportunities. The usual script, delivered with the usual ease. All the while, I was watching. Watching Evan gesture toward documents he'd pulled from his jacket, documents that looked from across the room remarkably similar to the proposal Marissa had given me last night. Watching him slide those documents toward one of my partners with a smile that suggested confidential opportunity. Watching the partner lean in, interested. I positioned myself near a pillar where I could observe without being obvious. The conversation across the room continued. More documents emerging, more nodding, more of the careful choreography that Evan and Marissa had clearly rehearsed many times. Then Marissa turned and saw me. Her expression didn't change. That was the remarkable thing. No flicker of surprise, no moment of recalculation, just a smooth pivot as she touched Evan's arm and murmured something that made him look up. Our eyes met across the crowd. Evan smiled and waved, the gesture of a son happy to see his father at a public event. But I'd been watching him for 20 minutes now. I'd seen the face he wore when he thought no one important was looking. The smile he was offering now was performance, nothing more. I waved back. Then I turned and walked toward the bar. Let them come to me. They did, of course. Within 3 minutes, Evan was at my elbow, Marissa trailing behind with her wine glass and her careful smile. Dad, I didn't know you were coming tonight. This is a pleasant surprise. I mentioned it when I called to confirm, I said mildly. Did you? I must have missed that. He glanced at Marissa, who offered a small shrug of manufactured confusion. Anyway, great that you're here. There are some people I want you to meet, partners, investors, really exciting opportunities we've been discussing. I saw you talking to Richard Hawley, I said. A tiny pause. Richard Hawley was one of my longest-standing investment partners. We'd worked together for 15 years. Just catching up, Evan said smoothly. You know how these events are. Everyone wants to network. I do know. Marissa stepped forward, her professional charm fully engaged. Cole, you look wonderful tonight. That suit, is it new? It's 12 years old? Well, it suits you. She laughed at her own wordplay, the sound practiced and hollow. Listen, we have a table reserved near the stage. The keynote speaker is supposed to be excellent. That consultant everyone's been talking about. You should join us. Perhaps later. Later? Evan's eyebrows rose. Come on, Dad. This is a family event. We should stick together. I looked at my son. Really looked, the way I'd been avoiding for years. The expensive clothes, the practiced gestures, the smile that never quite reached his eyes. I have some things to handle first, I said, but I'll find you before the speeches start. They exchanged a glance, quick, barely perceptible, but I caught it. Something had passed between them, a question, a concern. Good. I spent the next hour making rounds, speaking with partners I'd neglected, checking on my restaurant stations, reminding people, without ever saying so directly, that the Merrick restaurant group was mine, not something inherited or borrowed or available for discussion, but mine. At 8:30, my phone buzzed. A text from Nolan. Documents delivered, package at coat check, your name. I retrieved the package without comment. A small envelope, manila-colored, sealed with tape. Inside were the papers I'd requested, confirmations, signed statements, everything I needed for what came next. The keynote speaker was wrapping up when I returned to the main floor. Polite applause filled the space. Evan and Marissa were at their table near the stage, looking relaxed and confident, surrounded by people I recognized and a few I didn't. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone. And now, before we continue with our evening program, we have a special recognition ceremony. I began walking toward the stage. The walk felt longer than it was. 60 feet, maybe 70, through a crowd that parted without understanding why. I kept my pace steady, my expression neutral. People murmured as I passed. Recognition whispered between strangers, perhaps curiosity about where I was going and what I intended to do there. At the edge of the stage area, I stopped. The MC was still speaking, introducing some award or recognition I'd never heard of. I waited. Patience had carried me this far. It could carry me another few minutes. Then something shifted in my peripheral vision. I felt eyes on me, more than the casual glances of passers-by. Turning slightly, I saw Ruth Calder. She was standing near the back wall, her posture relaxed, her expression carefully neutral. She wasn't hiding, wasn't drawing attention to herself. She was simply observing, the same way she'd observed at the restaurant the night before. Our eyes met across the crowded room. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and raised her wine glass in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else entirely. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. I didn't follow. Whatever her role in this had been, whatever had motivated her to approach me, to give me the box, to set these events in motion, it was complete now. The rest was mine to handle. The MC finished his remarks. Applause scattered through the room. There was a brief pause as he consulted notes, preparing for the next segment of the evening's program. That was my moment. I stepped forward, climbing the 2 shallow stairs to the stage. The MC turned, startled, but I was already moving toward him with purpose. I apologize for the interruption, I said, taking the microphone from his hands before he could protest. I need to address some business matters that can't wait. The room went quiet, the kind of silence that falls when people sense something significant is about to happen but don't yet understand what. I found Evan's face in the crowd. He was frozen mid-drink, his glass suspended between the table and his lips, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. My name is Cole Merrick, I said, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the founder and sole owner of the Merrick Restaurant Group. I've been in this business for 30 years. I've built partnerships with many of you, worked alongside many more, and I have something important to say about the future of my companies. Silence. Complete, expectant silence. I pulled the manila envelope from my jacket, removed the documents inside, held them up so everyone could see. Over the past year, I continued, my voice steady and clear, my son Evan and his wife Marissa have been approaching my investment partners with proposals for restructuring. They've discussed succession planning without consulting me. They've obtained legal advice about challenging ownership structures they don't understand, and they've done all of this while pretending, to my face, that nothing was happening. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of phones being raised to record. I have copies of those discussions, I have recordings of those conversations, and I have legal confirmation, as of this afternoon, that every trust, every partnership agreement, every ownership structure remains exactly as I designed it, with control resting solely and permanently with me. Evan was standing now, his chair pushed back, his face pale. The proposals you've seen from my son are unauthorized. The representations he's made about succession are false, and any agreements discussed on those bases are void." I looked directly at Evan. He stared back, frozen, unable to respond. "The Merrick Restaurant Group is not for sale. It is not available for restructuring, and it is not subject to the ambitions of people who have confused presence with ownership." The crowd erupted. Chaos unfolded in waves. At first it was sound, voices rising all at once, overlapping and colliding as people tried to process what they had just heard. Confusion bled into shock, shock into alarm. Then came movement. Investors reached instinctively for their phones. Partners leaned toward one another in tight, urgent clusters. People who had arrived confident and relaxed now shifted in their seats, their comfortable assumptions cracking under the weight of what I had just exposed. The room itself seemed to contract, as if my words had pulled the air inward. Attention narrowed, focus sharpened. Everything pointed toward the stage where I stood, still holding the microphone, still holding the documents that had just rewritten the evening. There was no way to put them back now, no way to soften what had been revealed. Evan forced his way through the crowd toward me, his steps uneven, his shoulders tense. He moved like someone walking through water, slowed by panic and adrenaline fighting for control. His face was flushed, features twisted by an emotion that hovered between anger and fear. Probably both. "Dad, what are you doing?" he shouted. "This is insane. You're making a scene in front of everyone." I stepped back from the microphone just enough to let his voice carry into the sudden silence that followed his outburst. The room had gone still. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every phone was raised now, recording, every pair of eyes locked on the stage. "I'm protecting what's mine," I said calmly. My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It carried the steadiness of preparation, the tone of a man who had already walked through this moment 100 times in his head. "Something I should have done months ago," I continued, "when you first decided to go behind my back." "Protecting it from what?" Evan shot back, gesturing wildly, his arms slicing through the air with frantic energy. "From your own family? This is a misunderstanding. Whatever you think you know." "I have recordings, Evan." The words dropped into the silence like a weight. "I have documents," I went on. "I have a full year of evidence showing exactly what you and Marissa have been planning. Every meeting, every conversation, every consultation with lawyers about how to dismantle the safeguards I put in place to protect my work." A ripple passed through the crowd. Marissa appeared beside him then, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. For the first time since I'd known her, her composure wavered. The careful calm she had worn for years was cracking, revealing something sharper and more desperate beneath it. "Cole," she said quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's talk about this privately. There's no reason to turn this into a public spectacle." "I tried private," I said, cutting her off. My voice was colder now. "You came to me last night with a proposal, a plan to reduce me to an advisory role while you assumed control of everything I spent 30 years building. That wasn't a discussion, it wasn't collaboration, it was a coup." Her mouth opened, ready with a response, but I didn't give her the space. "The trust structures were designed to prevent exactly this," I continued, "and as of this afternoon, they've been reinforced. New provisions, new restrictions. Any attempt to challenge them is now effectively impossible. Whatever deals you thought you were striking, whatever assurances you gave my partners about future control, they're worthless. Every single one of them." Evan's expression fractured in real time. Denial slipped away, replaced by anger. Anger collapsed into something unmistakably darker. Fear. "You can't do this," he said, but the certainty was gone. The authority he'd arrived with had evaporated. "I already have," I replied. The crowd pressed closer, drawn in by the gravity of the moment. Phones captured everything, the tremor in Evan's hands, the tight set of Marissa's jaw, the stillness of a father watching his son unravel in front of everyone who mattered. There would be no forgetting this, no rewriting it. This was the moment it all became public. Richard Hawley pushed his way to the front of the gathered crowd. He was a large man, not loud, not theatrical, but imposing in the quiet way that only decades of influence can create. His presence carried the weight of long boardroom tables, closed-door negotiations, and decisions that had reshaped companies and careers. We had known each other since the earliest days of the restaurant group, back when I was still learning which risks were worth taking and which ones could dismantle everything I'd built. "Cole?" Richard said, his voice slicing cleanly through the noise of the room. "I think an explanation is in order, for all of us who've been having conversations with your son over the past several months." I nodded once and stepped back toward the microphone. The room stilled almost immediately, as if someone had reached up and turned down the volume on the world. Conversations faded. Bodies leaned forward, every ear strained for what came next. "Richard," I said evenly, You're right, and I owe you an apology. A few heads turned at that. My son approached you, and several others, with proposals I never authorized, I continued. He represented himself as speaking on behalf of the company, on behalf of the family business, when in reality he was speaking only for himself and for his own ambitions. Evan flinched. Any discussions you had with him regarding succession planning, restructuring, or future control were conducted entirely without my knowledge or approval. Richard absorbed this in silence, his expression carefully controlled, unreadable in the way seasoned negotiators learn to master. Then he turned his head slowly toward Evan, who stood rigid near the edge of the stage, his face pale, a thin sheen of nervous perspiration catching the light. Is this true? Richard asked. Evan opened his mouth, closed it again. For several seconds, no sound came out. Marissa stepped in, voice quick, rehearsed. There were preliminary conversations about possible future scenarios. I'm asking Evan, Richard cut in sharply, without even glancing at her. Is what your father just said true? Did you represent yourself as having authority you did not possess? The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Phones remained raised, recording every second. The crowd seemed to hold a single collective breath. It was supposed to be a surprise, Evan finally said, his voice thin. A way to help Dad transition into retirement gracefully. We never meant to. A transition I didn't request, I said, lifting the contents of the blue box. The documents caught the light as I held them up, clean copies, clearly labeled, undeniable. With terms that would have stripped me of controlling interest within 3 years, I continued calmly. According to these documents I received from an independent source who believed I had a right to know what was being planned inside my own company. Richard reached for the papers without a word. I handed them over. He read in silence, page after page. With each turn, his expression hardened, darkening into something unmistakable. When he finally looked up, his gaze locked onto Evan with a level of contempt that needed no explanation, the kind reserved for people who confuse ambition with legitimacy. You told me Cole was prepared to step aside, Richard said slowly. You said there was full consensus within the family. You said he was actively looking for an exit strategy and just needed the right offer. There was going to be consensus, Evan tried. Evan, Richard interrupted, his voice flat, cold, and final. You lied, to me, and based on what I'm hearing, to everyone else in this room who listened to your pitch and considered entering agreements built on false representations. A low murmur swept through the crowd, spreading outward like ripples across still water. Conversations ignited in hushed tones. Faces shifted, calculations being revised, alliances reconsidered, trust evaporating in real time. The damage was done, and everyone could see it. Marissa attempted recovery. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Evan and the hostile crowd, her most composed expression firmly in place despite the cracks that had begun to show. This was her territory. Damage control, narrative management, the art of spinning disaster into opportunity. She'd built a career on exactly this kind of moment. Everyone, please. This is a family matter that's gotten out of hand. Cole is clearly under enormous stress, and my husband was only trying to help shoulder some of the burden. Help himself, someone called from the crowd. I didn't see who, she pressed on, her voice taking on a soothing, reasonable tone. The proposals were preliminary. Nothing was finalized. If there's been miscommunication about intentions or timeline, we can absolutely address that through proper channels, privately. The time for private discussions was 9 months ago. I stepped forward, my presence commanding the stage. When you first started meeting with my partners without telling me. When you started soliciting legal opinions about how to challenge the trusts I created. When you told my investors that I was resistant to change and not understanding of modern business practices. Her composure cracked visibly. I never said, I have recordings. I let that fact hang in the air. 14 of them. Every conversation you and Evan had planning this takeover. Every strategy session about how to neutralize my influence. Every discussion about how to handle what you called the Cole problem. She went white. The color drained from her face so quickly it was almost theatrical. The phones around us captured every moment. Her reaction, Evan's mounting panic, the growing contempt on the faces of investors who had believed the lies they'd been told. Evan tried one final time. Dad, please. His voice had lost all its earlier confidence, reduced now to something closer to pleading. Let's talk about this somewhere else. We can explain everything if you just give us a chance. Explain what? I held the documents higher so everyone in the room could see them clearly. That you wanted what I built? That you thought I was old and out of touch and in the way? That you spent a year going behind my back because you were too impatient to wait, too arrogant to ask, and too certain that I'd never find out? He had no answer. For once in his life, my son had nothing to say. I would have helped you, Evan. If you'd come to me honestly, if you'd told me what you wanted, if you'd asked for guidance instead of plotting behind closed doors, I would have helped you build something of your own. That's what fathers do. That's what I've been trying to do for your entire life. I paused, letting the weight of that settle. But you didn't want help. You wanted control, and you thought you could take it without earning it? The room was silent. Even the whispered conversations had stopped. These documents, I gestured to the papers now circulating through the crowd, passed from hand to hand as investors read the evidence of betrayal, show exactly what kind of people you've been dealing with. Not partners, not heirs, opportunists who confuse my patience for weakness. I looked at the assembled investors and partners, people I'd worked with for years, people who had trusted my judgment and built relationships with my company. The Merrick Restaurant Group continues under my sole leadership. Any agreements, discussions, or representations made by my son or his wife are hereby null and void. I'll be reaching out to each of you individually to discuss the path forward and to rebuild any trust that may have been damaged by these unauthorized negotiations. Richard nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Others followed his lead. Evan and Marissa stood alone at the edge of the crowd. Phones pointed at them from every direction, their carefully constructed world collapsing around them. I walked to the edge of the stage. The crowd parted as I stepped down. Behind me, I could hear Evan saying something, pleading, maybe, or attempting some final justification. I didn't stop to listen. 30 years. 30 years of early mornings and late nights, of calculated risks and careful building, of creating something real from nothing but determination. They'd thought they could take it with schemes and meetings and proposals written in rooms I'd never entered. They were wrong. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. I stood on the sidewalk, inhaling deeply, feeling the weight of the evening begin to lift. Not everything was resolved. There would be conversations, adjustments, the slow work of reasserting control. But the critical blow had been struck. Ruth Calder materialized beside me. "Well done," she said simply. "Thank you for the box." She nodded. It was time. Why? The question I'd been holding all day. Why help me? She considered for a moment. Because some things shouldn't go unanswered, because your son chose poorly, and those choices have consequences. And because a faint smile crossed her face. I don't like bullies, even well-dressed ones. I looked back at the venue. Through the windows, I could see the crowd still gathered, still processing, cameras still recording. Evan and Marissa remained visible, isolated islands in a sea of judgment. Ruth extended her hand. I shook it. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's your choice, but if I were you," she glanced toward the building, "I'd leave them exactly where they are, explaining to everyone." I smiled, a real smile, the first in days. Then I walked to my car, got in, and drove home. The microphone was still on inside, the crowd was still watching, and my son, for the first time in his life, had absolutely nothing to say.